Is Michael Willis, and I'm the Director of PRONI, the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. You're all very welcome to this significant online conference marking 25 years since the historic visit of President Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton to Northern Ireland in 1995. PRONI is delighted to be delivering this webinar in collaboration with our partners at ARK and CAIN. As many of you will know, CAIN, which stands for the Conflict Archive on the Internet, has through its website provided an extensive range of information and source material on the conflict and politics from 1968 to the present day, and is used by a worldwide audience. CAIN is part of ARK, which is short for Access Research Knowledge, which was established in 2000 as a joint initiative of Queen's University Belfast and Ulster University to increase the use of academic data and research to support policy development. Today's online event is also part of the 20th anniversaries of ARK initiative, so happy birthday to ARK. There are a number of people that it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge at this stage. In particular, I would like to thank our distinguished panel of guest speakers, retired Ambassador Kathleen Stephens, who was US Consul General in Belfast during the Clinton visit, Professor Paul Arthur, who is Honorary Professor at Ulster University, Dr. Brendan Lynn, who is the Deputy Director of CAIN at Ulster University, and Anne Donnelly, who is the Access and Outreach Officer at Northern Ireland Screen. Proceedings will be overseen by Peter Osborne, who is currently chair of the ARK Advisory Board and who many of you will also know from previous roles, including as former chair of the Community Relations Council. I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to US Consul General Elizabeth Kennedy Trudeau, who is joining us today. And finally, I would like to thank my PRONI colleagues, David Huddleston and Janet Hancock, as well as Dr. Brendan Lynn, who have been the real driving force behind the organisation of today's conference. Thank you all. I would like to say a few words, if I may, about the value of conferences and events such as this for PRONI. As I mentioned, this is very much a joint enterprise, allowing PRONI the opportunity to showcase and highlight the value of partnerships we have with a wide range of organisations and institutions. These partnerships are central in allowing PRONI to deliver its statutory role of receiving, preserving and providing access to public records. From a PRONI perspective, events such as today's are key in a number of ways through promoting the intrinsic value of the public record, which we in PRONI care for, increasing the awareness and widening access to the public record among new audiences, helping to realise the potential of archives such as PRONI to contribute to historical study and contemporary social debate, and finally by connecting individuals and communities with broader narratives of our shared past. Today's event will also draw on another partnership that PRONI has developed with ITV and NI Screen. In 2018, PRONI partnered with Northern Ireland Screen and ITV to bring UTV's extensive film and television archive of around 90,000 items of film into PRONI's care. Thanks to this partnership, today's event will include a visual trip down memory lane from the time of the Clinton visit with footage from the UTV archive, which I'm sure we will all enjoy. And finally, the origins of today's event can be directly linked to another partnership, this time between PRONI and CAIN. The objective of this partnership has been to provide wider access to a selection of the material made available annually by PRONI under our annual release of records. There are currently over 2,600 PRONI public records on the CAIN website, amounting to some 11,000 digitised pages, and Brendan Lynn will be talking about some of his finds in relation to US-NI relations later on this afternoon. So enough from me. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm sure we will have an informative and enjoyable afternoon. So back to you now, David.
Thanks, Michael. I'm just now going to hand over to Dr. Paula Devine, the co-director of ARK, to say a few words.
Okay, thank you very much, David, and thank you to Michael. I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you very much and welcome everybody to the webinar this afternoon. As Michael has already said, ARK is Northern Ireland Policy Hub and was established in 2000 by researchers across Queen's and Ulster Universities. Again, this is a joint collaboration that is very important. The aim of ARK is to increase accessibility and the use of academic data and research. And CAIN is very much an integral part of the work that we're doing, and the collaboration with PRONI is a prime example of the type of work that ARK is aiming to do. As Michael said, this is our 20th anniversary year, so again, great to celebrate with such a fantastic event this afternoon. Since the PRONI records on CAIN became available in October 2010, it's allowed students, researchers, or anybody at all a fantastic opportunity to learn about or evaluate some of the key events and personalities from the selection of documents that from the official files that chart the troubled history of Northern Ireland. And it's really important that we are able to have access to that material. So just on behalf of ARK and CAIN, I want to thank PRONI for the part it has played in making all this work possible, and also in terms of organising today's event. I know it's not perhaps in the format that we'd originally envisaged, but it's thanks to the perseverance of everybody at PRONI and within CAIN that this event is happening today. I very much remember the Clinton visit from 25 years ago, so I'm really looking forward to today's event, and I hope everybody enjoys it. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. I'm now delighted to introduce Elizabeth Kennedy Trudeau, US Consul General, to say a few words of welcome.
Thank you, David, and especially thank you to PRONI, to CAIN, and ARK for hosting this event today. I'm pleased to be able to recognize not only one of my predecessors, Ambassador Stephens, but also Ambassador Norland, who was in Dublin at the time, as well as one of our colleagues, Blair Hall, who's on the call as well, who was stationed in London at the time. I think especially now, as we move to January 20th and a new administration coming in, this sort of event reminds us how important Northern Ireland is for the United States and our deep bipartisan ties with this wonderful place. So I know there's a lot of talk to come. It's a pleasure to be able to join you today, and thank you.
Well, can I add my thanks also to not just Michael and Paula, but to the US Consul Elizabeth Kennedy Trudeau for those words of introduction. And Elizabeth reminds us very pertinently 25 years on about the hugely constructive role the United States has played here in Northern Ireland and elsewhere in the world, and will continue to do so. Can I also thank PRONI and CAIN for organising the event today. And whenever you look at just a minute or so of the clips, it brings back memories for me of what was a seminal moment for Northern Ireland back in 1995. I remember taking part in the visit. I remember the excitement and the importance, but it also told us here with our local conflict that the wider world was watching. It told us the wider world was interested and the wider world was involved. It was an important part of our peace process that was evolving at that time. We're going to see and hear a lot more about the visit in 10 or 15 minutes time. But before we do, let's talk to two people who remember the visit more than anybody else, I suspect. We're going to hear, first of all, from Ambassador Kathleen Stephens. In 1995, Ambassador Stephens worked at the State Department and at the White House as Director of European Affairs. She then, in July 1995, was appointed as US Consul to Northern Ireland and remained in that position until after the Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998. Since then, Kathleen has been involved in many areas of conflict and post-conflict negotiations. She was ambassador to Seoul from 2008 until for 7 years. And she led the US diplomatic mission to India in 2014 to 15 as acting ambassador. She has been heavily involved in the former Yugoslavia, the Korean Peninsula, and many other places. and she is now president of the European Economic Institute based in Washington, D.C. Kathleen, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're also going to hear from Professor Paul Arthur. Paul has been a senior fellow at the United States Institute of Peace, a Fulbright Scholar at Stanford University, a Joan B. Kroc Peace Scholar at the University of San Diego, and a distinguished visiting Peace Professor at Chapman University, California. In 2018, Paul was presented with the Citizens Peacebuilding Award in recognition of his commitment to global peace through education at the University of California. He, of course, has spent many decades as a well-respected academic and professor in Northern Ireland, and on the day of the visit of President and Mrs. Clinton, was in the studio commenting on it all day. Let me start with Paul. Paul, 25 years on, it's really difficult to put yourself back in the place of the visit, but in 1995, Northern Ireland was politically fragile. Politics was feral. We were just after the first Drum Cree. The ceasefires of just less than 12 months before the visit. Can you give us a sense of this visit in its historical context and what was going on at that time?
Well, to go back to the question of the feral nature of politics at that time, we have to remember that unemployment was about 14%. In fact, of the 174 regions in the European Union, Northern Ireland was 159th in terms of unemployment. Political violence was continuing, although it was diminishing to some extent. And in fact, throughout the early 90s, more violence was coming from loyalists than from the IRA. Because early on, I think the Republican movement had decided that it had to move in some sort of peaceful direction. In 1992, it presented a document which recognized that violence was the point of last resort, and it began to become much more political. The two governments at the time were involved in talks with each other, but also establishing talks inside Northern Ireland, which were stop-start. But I think most importantly was what was happening in the wider world, both in Europe and in the United States. When Bill Clinton started his campaign to become president during 1992, on at least 2 occasions, he said that he would appoint a special US envoy to Northern Ireland because he recognized just how bad things were. And in fact, what we find during the Clinton presidency was the concept of soft power, that the way forward was through soft power, through direct inward investment. And he established a special envoy when he made Senator George Mitchell in that position. So we were beginning to move out of just the cloud of ongoing violence in the direction of talk, in the realization that we can't go on like this. And among the wider public, I think it's worthwhile recording that there was a terrible war weariness. For example, Sunday Independent in February of 1994 carried out a major poll in both parts of Ireland and found that 91% of the population wanted to renounce violence. And as well as that, the Financial Times had done a poll among business executives in Northern Ireland, and 91% of business executives said that they would be prepared to allow Sinn Féin to come into negotiations if there was a renunciation of violence. So we're moving from violence towards talks, and we needed something to kick that off. And what kicked it off was the interest shown by the United States and by Europe.
And it's fascinating at the time. And I'm wondering, Ambassador Stephens, Kathleen, were you aware of the politics here at the time? You presumably were very much. The sensitivity of relationships a year after ceasefires were declared, and even in some ways, a visit that some people within unionism and maybe even the British government would have thought was a president starting to walk on ground that was ground of internal affairs for the United Kingdom government.
Well, thank you, Peter. Yes, I was keenly aware of it when I arrived in Belfast in the summer of 1995. And certainly many I talked to wanted to make sure that I remained keenly aware of the sensitivities. I'm going to go into a little bit of context and background to build on what Paul said in terms of how the Clinton administration got involved. But before I do, I have to do a little bit of a shout out, not by name, but I appreciate Elizabeth mentioning my former colleagues, Blair and Blair Hall and Ambassador Dick Norland, both tuning in, and others who tune in. I see many friends here from Northern Ireland as I scroll through, and it makes me rather emotional to think about this time. I want to make one more shout out to Brady Williamson, who was the senior White House person on the ground in the advance team as we talk about the visit. He was the genius behind a lot of this.
You'll just have to come back to Northern Ireland and visit everybody again.
I know, we can't get away, but it's really, and I love seeing the clips and lovely to see all of you. I also have to add to Elizabeth, and she said, I actually, when I arrived as the new Consul General in Belfast in 1995, there was a good deal of skepticism, I would say politely expressed from people I met on all sides, of why the United States has for the first time sent a woman to be the Consul General in Northern Ireland. But as a lot of things have changed and not changed over 25 years, but I'm happy to say I'm no longer only the first woman to serve in that post, that wonderful post, but by far not the only or the best. And it's great to see Elizabeth there and many of my successors who followed. I mean, unlike a lot of diplomatic postings, I did come to Belfast a little bit forewarned, I guess I would say, because from 1992 onwards, just as the US was in its election, this is George H.W. Bush running for a second term post-Cold War against that upstart governor from Arkansas, Bill Clinton. Yes, as Paul said, it was much noted, I think, in the UK and in Ireland and Northern Ireland that candidate Clinton had promised two things. In what was seen, I think, by many as an appeal to the Irish-American vote. And that was a special envoy for Northern Ireland and a visa for Gerry Adams. And I was the UK desk officer at the State Department at the time. And I remember the British Embassy had as its prime directive when Clinton was elected in the transition. I remember that transition, we're going through it now again. Their prime directive was to make sure that the new president and his staff were persuaded that these were not good ideas, either of them. And that was the situation in that first year of the Clinton presidency. And it created some tension in the US-UK special relationship. Some other things did as well in that post-Cold War world, but there was certainly a sense that, yes, this was an internal affair. The US had always thought of it as that and should stay out. But things were beginning, as Paul mentioned, to be shift on the ground and also shift between London and Dublin. And I think with the Downing Street Declaration, the joint declaration in December 1993, that kind of opened the door, if you like, for the Clinton administration to get involved. And President Clinton actually issued a White House statement about it, which is a little bit unusual, welcoming this. And then that opened the ground for a lot of things that happened in 1994. And of course, the Gerry Adams visa in January was something that President Clinton decided was the risk for peace that he talked so much about in the visit he was ready to take, despite the opposition of many in his own cabinet. And then further work behind the scenes to achieve and to support the ceasefire, which first declared, of course, by the Provisional IRA and then by the Loyalists in August and in the autumn of 1994. And with that, and just by that time, I had moved from the State Department to the White House to the National Security Council because this had become a real priority for the Clinton administration. And the administration really went into high gear, again, with a lot of skepticism, never mind in London, skepticism in Washington too from the establishment, but supporting economic initiatives and investment in Northern Ireland. In fact, many people may not recall that was the first role that George Mitchell had. This was a more acceptable role for the British, right? That the US could play a role in trying to support the economic investment and development that would be necessary to underpin a peace. But I think from then 94, 95 on, it was very much in President Clinton's mind. He wanted to be the first US president, sitting US president, to visit Northern Ireland. I understand Ulysses Grant visited after it was a president, didn't go well, but that was a long time ago. So by the time that the ceasefires had really sort of seemed to have stabilized a bit in 1995, the decision was made that the president was going to announce that he was going to visit Northern Ireland. But even with that announcement out there, I think, yes, there were skeptics in London. There were skeptics I met on the ground in Northern Ireland, I think particularly from the unionist community, who just didn't see how a president could come and not be seen as taking sides.
So the issue of the visa, Kathleen, months before the visit, the many discussions that took place by the sound of it between the British and American governments, and even internally within the US administration, there was lots of discussion and lots of disagreements. Did that give you full confidence that the visit was the right thing to do and would go smoothly?
Well, I think between the first visa issuance in January 1994 and the declaration of the ceasefire, there was a considerable tension in the London-Washington relationship. And certainly absent a ceasefire, I don't think that an American president, President Clinton, could have made the visit he did. But with the establishment of the ceasefire, you had that year between the ceasefire announced in August, September, and then the Loyalists joining, and a very serious outreach by the White House itself, not only to the Sinn Féin and to Gerry Adams, but of course to the nationalist community and very importantly to the unions community. So we had a succession of unionist leaders coming to the White House and getting a kind of presidential attention, which was really unprecedented. I mean, my colleagues in the State Department used to say, how do leaders from Northern Ireland get meetings with the president when heads of state and government of important other countries don't get into the White House at all? So that attention that preceded the visit was very important, I think, in setting the context and in developing a confidence and some people might say hubris, but a confidence that if President Clinton came to Northern Ireland, that he could help to not only celebrate the ceasefires, but consolidate them and help to push the political process forward. Of course, that, like almost anything having to do with Northern Ireland and politics, proved to be easier said than done, but there was a determination to go to Northern Ireland and very, very concentrated attention and understanding it was going to be a very complex thing to organize and do right.
I suspect we'll come back to the time that President Clinton gave to the visit and pre-visit and post-visit as well, because as you said, it was quite extraordinary. But we saw in the film, Paul, elements of that visit, very famously a speech at Mackey's with the children speaking as well. I would love them to be on this webinar because I would want to see what they look like now. We had the famous visit to and speech at the Guildhall, and of course, an engagement with political and community representatives in East Belfast. But we also saw the handshake on the Falls Road, which was one of the major pieces of news. Coincidentally, Gerry Adams was obviously doing some shopping on the Falls Road and the cavalcade just happened to stop at the same time. Paul, give us a sense of what was the effect of these things on both the unionist community in Northern Ireland and the nationalist and Republican community in Northern Ireland at the time?
There always had been much greater scepticism on the unionist and loyalist side. And that famous handshake certainly would have added to that scepticism had it not been for the fact that the way that that day was organized was a masterpiece in diplomacy. Before the handshake, the president had gone to Mackey's and he made his famous speech. During the day, the First Lady had visited Joyce McCartan and some of the people in South Belfast, and the day finished with the visit to the East Belfast Partnership. That is before going on to Derry and then coming back that night for the famous party outside the White House. But really, what was happening was that you had to balance the substance of the trip with the logistics of the trip. You had to make sure that it wasn't simply being remembered for that handshake, but it was really about economic investment. And it was really about the United States holding out the hand of friendship and internationalizing the quest for peace. Because the more the quest was kept inside a dialogue inside Northern Ireland, the more incestuous it became. Once the United States and Europe began to give the interest that it did, it then became possible for the really big decisions to be made. And I think we see that in the aftermath of the visit as well. And we also need to keep in mind Kathy's already alluded to it, the Joint Declaration of December 1993, that was another diplomatic masterpiece, because they come up with a form of words which was attempting to do the impossible, to bring both the IRA and the Combined Loyalist Military Command away from violence and towards peace. And they achieved that. It took them a long time to do it, but they achieved that. And while they were trying to achieve that, the United States was firstly giving the visa to Gerry Adams, and Adams came back again in October. They were very slow to let him anywhere near the White House. The first visit was only for 48 hours. The second visit was for 2 weeks. So what I'm trying to sketch out was a very carefully choreographed diplomatic exercise to demonstrate that people could come from war into peace. And in that respect, it was a huge success.
And Paul, how, given the balances that needed to be made by people locally, by the British and Irish governments, and then by the American and other governments, how was everything held together? Were there times when it nearly slipped off the edge in those first months and years of the peace process?
No question about that. I mean, it nearly slipped off the edge once the visa had been granted to Gerry Adams. Downing Street refused to speak to the White House for about a week after that, or maybe even longer. And again, as Kathy has pointed out, inside the United States administration as well, there was a great degree of skepticism. The Secretary of State had been against giving the visa. The FBI, the CIA, the US ambassador to London was against it. And yet, had it not been for the National Security Council advisors, persuaded the president to stick with it. Equally, once you had the breakdown in the ceasefire in February of 1996, there was major pressure being put on President Clinton to just forget about it all and concentrate on other things, and he refused to do so. And again, when you had the Oma bomb, the president came back to Northern Ireland within a month or so and made a major speech in Armagh to make sure that the whole thing held together. And the fact that the United States put so much effort into it meant that both Dublin and London were also putting a great deal into it. It was more difficult for London because John Major, as Prime Minister at the time, relied on the Ulster Unionist Party to keep him in office, and therefore he had to play things more carefully. But he played it, and he played a major role in seeing that it all went smoothly. So yes, there were lots of problems along the way, but there was the stickability of the US administration which managed to hold it together.
Kathleen, I want to ask you in a moment about the day itself, but just taking up Paul's point there, was there any time, any point where the president was thinking, we don't go through with this?
I don't believe so, no. I think that the period between the declaration, again, of the ceasefires in the late summer, autumn of 1994, the engagement, the broadening engagement by the White House itself and the US especially with the unions and the loyalist communities, the economic work. I think everyone felt there was an optimism that we are going to do this and we're going to go through. That, notwithstanding that, there was a big political problem that still, even with the ceasefires, that remained, and that was we couldn't find, I mean collectively, but especially the parties in London and Dublin, couldn't find a way to get to the parties to the table. We had the issue of decommissioning, if you recall, the decommissioning of terrorist weapons, the question of, in all party talks, who would come and under what conditions. So that was certainly something that loomed right up to the night of the visit. And indeed, if you look at the newspapers from November 28th and 29th, there's a Belfast Telegraph headline on November 29th is Clinton's mission impossible because of the stalemate over getting talks. I mean, the hope was to also use the visit as kind of catalyst to get something going on the talks, and it wasn't happening. Now, in fact, I guess this takes us up to the day. I mean, really in the wee hours of November 29th into the visit, an agreement between London and Dublin, and again, the involvement of the two capitals was very important with the parties on the so-called twin track approach was outlined, and George Mitchell, who remember had been an economic sort of czar for Northern Ireland, was going to become the chair of a decommissioning commission. So that removed a big obstacle, if you like, in terms of how could people point to the visit and say, look, you know, we haven't even gotten talks started. So it was fragile, but that happened. But no, I think from that summer on, certainly from, you know, my arrival in Belfast out of Washington, I mean, my main mission for that first 3 months, with a lot of help from other capitals and from Washington, was to put together a visit that, you know, was a very unusual visit, because we weren't visiting a capital. There wasn't, you know, a sort of a prime minister or a president to see, and it just wasn't, you know, no one really had an idea of what we would do. So this was kind of a blank slate for us in a way, although, you know, as all of you in Northern Ireland know, there's no shortage of opinions about what wouldn't work.
Well, in about 10 minutes, we're going to see and hear more about the visit. Can I just remind everybody, if you want to ask questions for the open session, after that time, please do use the chat function. I liked, amongst others, I liked Mark Doherty's message that he left his heavily pregnant wife to go and visit the president in the city centre, his speech in the city centre. Not sure what that said, or what he said to his wife to be able to get away, but there you go. And I'm not sure what you've called your child, whether it was Bill or Hillary or something else, Mark, but great commitment to the visit. But Kathleen, Paul called it a diplomatic masterpiece. Did it feel like that on the day? That must have been the busiest day of your life, running around, being the focal point of organising everything. Did everything go as expected, or were there last minute hitches?
I mean, I have to say the day was a dream, and you know, and I feel like I think so many people vivid memories of just about every moment of it, which I can't say a lot about in a lot of days in my life. It went better than expected in every way. But, you know, it really was the culmination of, I mean, I've described kind of some of the more traditional diplomatic work that went on, but of the kind of planning that went into thinking about what would a day that nobody really imagined look like. And one thing, just to give you an example, a few things we did try to do was we realized, one, that, again, this was not I mean, the Northern Ireland office, when they kind of heard about the visit or knew about the visit, they began to talk to us as if it was a royal visit. You know, they had a template for how they did these things. And then they realized pretty quickly that that wasn't the way that we were going to approach it. And, you know, we had, I mean, lots of care always goes into a presidential visit, but really, I don't think I've ever seen in my career one where so much thought was given to how we're going to organize, how we're going to bookend the messages and consolidate the ceasefires in a way that reaches a broad audience. So in Belfast, I mean, I think, and in Northern Ireland, you know, we did try to do some things which are not usually associated with traditional diplomacy. We had a poster contest, you know, so students could submit a poster to, because we decided we wanted to get a crowd out to City Hall. We had a letter writing contest for students. Again, it may seem a little, we say in the US, hokey, I guess, but you know, it was a way of sort of trying to reach and say, this is a visit that's about the people. We spent a lot of time looking at sites for things, because again, the symbolism. We knew that the president we would start with a policy message in the morning, so that would be the message for the trip. That was what's now known as the Mackey speech. But the decision of where to have that, what messages that sends, you know, we spent a lot of time thinking about those things and trying it out. And, you know, none of us are from there. So the idea of kind of building a sense of public excitement about it, thinking of what would reach across traditional lines, that's where that kind of effort went. And then, of course, there was all the who do you meet and how, and who's willing to meet and what formation, and that's more traditional diplomatic work. But I mean, one other example, I suppose, I mean, if the one bookend was the Mackey speech, you know, we realized that the Christmas tree lighting in City Hall was one of the maybe few things in Northern Ireland. I mean, some of you can correct me, but this is my recollection. That was kind of across the sectarian lines, that people would come for the Christmas tree lighting in front of City Hall. And so we thought, well, that'd be a nice thing. Maybe we could have be a little early this year. And so we approached City Hall about it. They said, well, it was a little early. We'd have to change the date. And they said, besides, we've already booked someone to turn on the Christmas tree lights, and it might have been announced, and it might upset people if we change it. So, well, who have you booked? They said, we booked the Power Rangers. Now, I didn't know who the Power Rangers were 25 years ago, and maybe you don't know now, but they were kind of like cartoon figures, I think. Forgive me if I have that wrong. But this was actually a big controversy for a while. Was Bill Clinton, those aggressive Americans, going to disappoint the children of Northern Ireland by elbowing aside the Power Rangers? We had a tree that came from Nashville, Tennessee, which was Belfast's sister city. And it turned out for a tree to be sent from Nashville to Belfast, it had to go through EU clearance procedures. And at one point, somebody from the NIO, who I have to say was very cooperative, I'm trying to get through these small things, said the whole thing reminded him of a lost episode from Yes Minister, because the tree would have to be reduced to pulp in order to meet the EU standards. So, I don't think it's a masterpiece of diplomatic prowess, but there's diplomacy in the smallest things. And it really took a very, very large team of people to think about both the political implications of it, the public, if you like, the public perceptions of it, and just what was going to work. But given all that, I'm sorry to be so long-winded, once it started happening, it just clicked. And again, President and Mrs. Clinton were so engaged in this themselves. I went out to Aldergrove Airport. I was there, of course, about 3 hours early. And I rode with President and Mrs. Clinton to Mackey's. And, they had just come from London, where they'd spent the day, a late dinner in the evening. And I'll always remember, President Clinton, you kind of sit on a jump seat in that giant car, which impressed everybody in Belfast, right? The motorcade, the helicopters, everything. And by the way, we hired every limousine in all of Northern Ireland and many south of the border to carry everybody around. But the president had his own car. I'm sitting in the jump seat. He pulled out of a backpack several books about Northern Ireland from a variety of sources, and began to go page by page through his speech, honing it, asking for information about, kind of other things he might introduce into it. So he was engaged from that very beginning, and that just lasted the whole day. So yeah, you can tell from all of us who were here on the call and me speaking, for us, this was a great highlight of our careers and our lives to help that play some part in putting this together. But really it was, President Clinton kind of, once he got there, just feeling it. It was a masterful political and diplomatic performance, and it just grew and grew.
Yeah, the president was immersed, I suppose, in the visit and the meaningfulness of it. As I have to say, Kathleen, you obviously were as well, and as somebody pointed out in the chat function, the fact that you used the phrase "we small R's" means there's a bit of Northern Ireland has remained with you. It's not many people. I don't know if the "we small R's" were understood in Korea or the former Yugoslavia when you did some diplomacy there, but we understand the "we small R's" here. But Paul, can I ask you, as we wind up this section before we move on to the next, was elbowing the Power Rangers out of the way worth it in the end? What was the impact of the visit in the longer term?
I think the impact is still with us today. The peace we have is by no means perfect. There are major problems with it. But all you need to do is look at the demography of violence to see, how the distance we've come. I also think it's worthwhile pointing out that when the Clinton presidency came to an end, I think most people thought US interests would wane. But every successive president since then has had an envoy dealing with Northern Ireland. And that combination of the European Union's interests and the United States interests has taken us through some of our darkest hours. I mentioned earlier, for example, the president's visit to Armagh after the Omagh bomb. And in fact, if you go back to the breakdown of the cessation of violence with the bombs in London in February of 1997, again, the president stayed with it. So if you didn't have that sustained interest, a sustained interest backed up by direct investment, you just have to look around Belfast now to see the number of US companies that who've set up business. So all of that has meant that we have come the distance we've come, and I don't think it would have been possible, would have been imaginable if we didn't have that sustained interest from the United States.
And I suppose finally, Kathleen, the United States, in my view, has generally had a very powerful and positive impact when it has been a an outward-looking, generous United States. And I think that's what naturally comes to America and Americans. Hopefully we'll see a lot more of that as well in years to come. Do you think the visit, you were here up until the Good Friday Agreement and just beyond, do you think the visit helped prepare the ground for what was to come?
Well, thank you for those words about the US. I share your hopes. Yes, I do. And that said, as Paul has already mentioned, 1996 was a very tough year. You know, we had the breaking of the ceasefire, the bombing in the Docklands. I think it was in January '96, and another, and you know, things were not going very well. But what I think the visit did was, I mean, first of all, certainly from a U.S. perspective, I think that the notion of a U.S. role was accepted. It was accepted in London, it was accepted in Northern Ireland, and there was no going back from that, that the U.S. could and should play a constructive role, an important role. But to me, I have to say, as someone living in Belfast, in Northern Ireland for those 3 years, to me, and it was a great time to be Consul General there. It's always a great time to be Consul General, but especially then somehow, because what I saw was, I think that the politicians, including those who came out of the Republican and the loyalist traditions, but on all sides, the politicians saw that people wanted the ceasefires back at a minimum. You know, I think it created I don't want to say a firewall, I'm not sure what, but it created a little bit of a backstop against too much backsliding. So that's a little intangible, I know, but the fact that we're still talking about it 25 years later, you know, it seems to me there was just even though the ceasefires, you know, did not remain unbroken for even a few months after that glorious day when the Clintons were there was still a sense we got to get back to it. And I think the politicians felt that pressure as they went into the talks finally from people, that yes, there is still enormous, you know, divides over all the issues you all know so well in the north of Ireland, but there was a sense of we don't want to go back to what it was before. And I think that, you know, that day, and the fact that people still remember 25 years later, that day it felt different, really helped to consolidate a different sort of set of political calculations, if you like, in Northern Ireland.
And let me briefly ask both of you before we move on, literally 10-second answers. The visit came, I'm going to amalgamate two questions that came in as you were talking. The visit came between changes in Eastern Europe and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And my goodness, we still have our peace barriers here up twice as long as the Berlin Wall and twice as high as some walls in Jerusalem still, but they're still here 50 years on. But the Berlin Wall came down 5 years or so before the visit. And of course, it was 5 or 6 years before 9/11. Was that period helpful to the fact that the visit took place and we were able to reach our agreement, or do you think that those things had no effect? Paul first, maybe.
Yeah, very important. The fall of the Berlin Wall changed everything. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of apartheid in South Africa changed everything. You had the PLO, you had the ANC and the IRA, who more or less all sang from the same hymn sheet. And to some extent, they were influenced by a Marxist ideology, some more than others. With the end of the Berlin Wall, you had the end of the Cold War, you were moving into a new period when people had to revision their old thoughts. And Republicans were among the first to do that revisioning, but they needed someone to help them along the way. And that's where the United States came into play. And the more the question was internationalized, in a sense, the more easy it was to solve. We got away from small differences and we began to address the bigger questions. Just one example of it. On the day of 9/11, Richard Haas, who was President Bush's special envoy, came to Belfast and Dublin to have talks to the Republican movement. And while he was there, 9/11 occurred. That changed the dynamic completely, because the peaceniks inside the Republican movement realized that the only way forward was to renounce violence totally and move in the direction of peace. So yes, that international dimension is incredibly important.
Kathleen.
I would just answer with respect to US involvement then. Yeah, I think that the kind of involvement that Bill Clinton spearheaded was really only possible in the 90s, after the end of the Cold War, that with a different geopolitical situation. I think before that, again, the considerations of the geopolitics of Europe, the relationship with London would have made it much more difficult for an American president to put so much time and effort into this issue. And post 9/11, had we not already been involved, I think it would have been very, very difficult because of the experience that the United States had and what it did to our politics and our reaction. But so I think we were lucky in a way that we got involved when we did. And I find Paul's comment about what happened exactly on 9/11, and I've heard some other stories also very interesting. But that only happened because we were already involved, I think.
Okay, look, I could spend all day talking to the two of you because I just find that absolutely fascinating as somebody who lived through it, along with probably most people who are joining us today. As I say, a seminal visit, but to hear some of the inside thoughts from the two of you is absolutely wonderful, and we could talk all day. But we can't do that because we have to move on and see and hear a lot more about the background to the visit and the visit itself. And can remind everybody who's here, we're going to come back to Paul and Kathleen and maybe one or two others to ask further questions. So if you have questions that you want to ask, please do use the chat function and we'll do our best to get to all of those questions in the rest of the session before we finish no later than 4:45. But let's see and hear more about that critical visit from President and Mrs. Clinton in 1995. And we're going to start off with Janet Hancock from the Public Records Office. Janet.
Peter, thank you very much. I've kind of lost my way there because I've been so enthralled listening to Ambassador Stephens and Professor Arthur's insightful comments. In this section, we'll be looking at the role of archives in preserving the raw material that documents events like the Clintons' visit and their value in helping us explore such events and indeed their context and legacy. And as we've been unable to host today's event at PRONI, I think we have a little montage. If my colleague can here we go. Sorry, yeah, so we have a little, we were unable to host today's event in PRONI as was originally planned, so we've just pulled together a little montage so that those of you who haven't previously visited can get a better idea of what our archive and indeed a contemporary archive looks like. This is a look into our stores. PRONI holds approximately 3.5 million records relating mainly but not exclusively to Northern Ireland. This is our conservation suite. With our head conservator, Sarah. Our earliest archive dates back to 1219. However, the majority of the period cover the period from the 17th century onwards. PRONI was established in 1923 in the wake of partition with the remit of collecting the official record of Northern Ireland. And this includes the records of government departments, previously ministries, as well as non-departmental public bodies. And it is these records which Brendan has been selecting from for the CAIN website over the last 11 years, which as part of the annual release. PRONI also collects a wide range of material from privately deposited sources, organisations, businesses and individuals, and they come in many formats. In 2018, the Department for Communities via PRONI embarked on a partnership with NI Screen to collect the UTV archive. So there's around 90,000 items on tape and various other formats, which provide a unique visual account of the cultural, social and political history of NI. For the eagle-eyed amongst you might recognise a Steenbeck viewing and editing table which came across from Havelock House into our UTV viewing room at PRONI. And we're just going to be handing over to a little bit of footage of Dr. Brendan Lynn in the reading room.
My name is Dr. Brendan Lynn. I'm in the reading room at the Public Records Office. Table in front of you to see a collection of it's from those files that I make a selection of documents for inclusion on CAIN. Would it be useful just to let you have a little insight into one of the files that I've looked at in terms of preparing for this afternoon's webinar, and I'll just open it for you so you can take a look. Okay, here we have in front of you a file from the early 1990s. It's relating to political developments in Northern Ireland at the time, and of particular interest, it specifically refers to the interest of the US government.
Okay. Thanks, Janet. And I think we're going to, Brendan, you're going to say a bit more, are you, about some of those papers? Where are you? I can't see you on the screen. There you go.
Hey, yes, Peter, I'll go on to talk about that now. On occasions like this, I'm very conscious of the time constraints, so I'll maybe jump straight into my presentation. So, Lindsay, could I have the first slide? Okay. Okay, so I just wanted to begin with giving you a brief overview of how CAIN has developed a range of archival material through partnerships with the two national archives on the island of Ireland. As people are aware, CAIN is now recognised as one of the leading online resources on the Northern Ireland Troubles. That's borne out in terms of people using the site. Since 1997, we've had some 21 million visits and some 80 million page views. 2/3 of our users come from outside of UK and Ireland. And we've noticed over the past 9 months or so an increased usage of CAIN, I guess, as people have been looking around for resources in times of lockdown. From the outset, CAIN has worked with individuals, groups and organisations to make information available online. And we largely do that through what we call associate site status. And there are now over 30 of those in CAIN. And I've just included a URL there for people. Lindsay, could we have the next slide? Let me give you 2 examples of those associate sites. The first of these is PRONI Records on CAIN. It was launched back in October 2010, and it contains a selection of public records drawn from the Northern Ireland government departments. It covers the period, say, from 1968 until 1992. And there's in the region of 2,600 items now available. That was followed a short time later by the development of a National Archives record in Dublin from the National Archives in Dublin, launched in October 2012, and it contains a selection of Irish government records relating to developments north of the border. And in terms of that work with the National Archive in Dublin, that has been largely supported and funded through the Reconciliation Fund within the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. And we're very grateful and I wish to acknowledge the support of that fund to allow us to do that work over the past 8 or 9 years now. Lindsay, next slide, please. I wanted to begin here by sharing with you some of the documents that we now have on CAIN, which illustrate the interaction between the US and Northern Ireland. The first document on the left-hand side is entitled US Administration Attitude to Northern Ireland. But it in fact was produced by Irish government officials back in 1984, believe it or not, for another presidential visit in June 1984 by then President Ronald Reagan. And the content here is very much about summing up the position of how the Irish government sees the situation back in 1984, but it also sets the scene for what develops over the next decade or so, in that there's a realization that Dublin has to continue to work to try to persuade policymakers in Washington to take a more sympathetic view of how Dublin perceives developments within Northern Ireland in terms of how to search for a solution. But also crucially, it also highlights the fact that the realization is there that that is going to take a hell of a lot of work, simply because of the fact that, as Kathleen and others have pointed out, Paul has pointed out earlier on, the strength of the US State Department there, that it was always established practice that America was not going to interfere in Northern Ireland in a way which would upset or annoy the authorities in London. So there was always that struggle, that always something that policymakers in Dublin were very conscious of. The second example here comes from a paper produced for a conference back in 1990 and delivered by a State Department official. And it's very much, what we have here is very much a example of the US standard practice towards Northern Ireland, in terms of making it clear that while the US was willing to help, offering a supporting role in the search for a solution, crucially, it didn't want to be seen to be taking sides in that search, but also recognizing the fact that, if you like, the senior partner in trying to move the situation on in Northern Ireland was very much through the British government, the UK government. And if anything, the role of the Irish government was more seen as more of a, I hate to use the term, but yeah, the term almost like a junior partner. But the priority had to be with the authorities in London.
Let me just briefly interrupt, Brendan. Kathleen, Ambassador Stephens, can I ask you? Brendan's looking at a document there where it doesn't quite say this, but it's almost like the major partner is the British government, the minor partner is the Irish government. Is that how the American Clinton administration would have seen things, or would you have seen the British and Irish governments as equal partners in this process?
Well, I think that what you're seeing, I mean, from the 80s and going on, that the well-established notion that the US and the UK have, and it was a special relationship, and you know, and through our NATO alliance, through all the ways that we work together, we still work together, that, yeah, this was a key strategic relationship. I think the relationship with Dublin was seen, right, in a different context, because, you know, the Republic did not carry the kind of economic and strategic weight, not a member of NATO. But as Ireland became part of the EU, this is another part of, I think that also began to change the nature of the relationship, and in this post-Cold War EU till Brexit knitted together world.
And I suppose we'll let Brendan get on with it in just a moment, Brendan. But Paul, the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985 was pretty important in equalising that relationship out, was it?
I think it was very important. I think the first thing that was important was the fact that Ireland joined the European Economic Community on the 1st of January 1973, the same time as the UK and Denmark. And once they joined, the relationship between the UK and Ireland was one of coordinate membership rather than superordinate and subordinate. So psychologically, Ireland's membership of Europe was incredibly important. Again, in 1977, you had the Carter Statement, when President Carter for the first time, veered slightly from the special relationship with the UK, because up until then, the position of the State Department always had been to follow the UK religiously. Now they began to veer slightly by saying that the United States would have a role to play. But yes, it was very, very important. The 77 Carter Statement led to the 1985 Anglo-Irish Agreement. If you read the Carter Statement and then go to the agreement, you can see many of the ideas in the agreement came from that Carter Statement. So the agreement really did cement the coordination between the UK and Ireland, rather one of junior and senior partner, and equally the United States was more than happy to be part of that relationship.
Okay, thank you, Brendan. Sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay. I'll maybe move on to the next slide then. In terms of the files at PRONI, the majority of files at PRONI that have US-related content, the vast majority, and I can't stress this enough, the vast majority of these are devoted to the campaign in America during the 1980s and early 1990s in relation to the McBride principles and the campaign around fair employment issues in Northern Ireland. And the one example I just picked out comes from, as you can see, from 1987. And it recounts the visit of the then head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, Sir Kenneth Bloomfield, who makes a 4 or 5 day visit to the States to specifically try to counteract the McBride campaign that was ongoing at this time. And the document itself is interesting in that Bloomfield makes the case that he understands that in terms of fair employment, a lot of ground, a lot of improvements still has to be carried out in Northern Ireland, but he remains vehemently opposed to the McBride campaign in the States. But he also goes on to make the case, and this comes through in many, many other documents, that if that campaign is going to be taken on and countered, it's going to need a lot of money, a lot of manpower, a lot of resources to ensure that that campaign is countered. And that's certainly the case remains well into the rest of the 1980s and the early 1990s, where you see the huge amount of time and effort being put in by particularly the British government, helped by officials in Belfast, to counter that particular campaign. Okay, I want to move on then to the early 1990s, and the next slide is a good example of that. These relate to 1992. The first mention that I came across of the name Bill Clinton, or Governor Clinton as he was in that time, and it comes to the attention of British officials in Washington simply by a contribution or his appearance at a campaign event for the Democratic presidential nomination in New York in early April 1992. I'm sorry that the document on the right-hand side is very faint, but when you go online, you can read it a little bit better. Particularly, this is the transcript of Clinton's comments to that event organised by Irish American groups in New York, where he goes on, as people have suggested earlier on, he makes a couple of comments which cause alarm. He raises again this idea that the US should consider sending a peace envoy to Northern Ireland. He raises the possibility of granting a visa to Gerry Adams to visit the States. And he also makes very sympathetic noises and support for the McBride principle. So obviously that brings his name and his candidature to the attention of officials in Washington. And the document on the left-hand side is a good example of this. And it's also struck me at the time because it was written by a then little known British diplomat in America, a man called Jonathan Powell, who springs to attention in the late 1990s, early 2000s as Tony Blair's chief negotiator in Northern Ireland. And Powell is a diplomat in Washington at the time, and he seems to be shadowing the presidential campaign at this time, and he has taken an interest in Clinton. And this is his little report back to his superiors about his views on what Clinton has said. And it's interesting in that, in one sense, he makes the point not to be too concerned, in that what Clinton has just said is something that frequently politicians and political parties do during campaigns. They make all kinds of promises that sometimes are then forgotten about and never brought again to attention. But he also makes the point that he will continue to liaise closely with the Clinton campaign team at the time to try to ensure that Clinton doesn't make these public commitments again. Okay.
Sorry, Brendan. That document is saying from Jonathan Powell saying that they're going to try to ensure Governor Clinton at that time doesn't make those public comments again. Is that what you're saying?
He's sort of trying to, make the case that perhaps Clinton is maybe unaware of the complexities and the delicacies of the situation in Northern Ireland, that he's going to work on the Clinton team to ensure that Bill Clinton is more knowledgeable about what the impact of some of the things he might say could actually have an impact on Northern Ireland.
Kathleen, I can't resist asking you, in your role here, especially after 1997, when presumably Jonathan Powell was involved in all of the different things that led up to the Good Friday Agreement. Does that surprise you? What he was saying in 1992?
No, it doesn't. I mean, I actually knew Jonathan Powell when he was assigned to the British Embassy, because as I was the State Department as the UK desk officer. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't want to cite people by name, and in this case, I don't mean Jonathan Powell, but during the transition, once Clinton was elected, it was very clear that British diplomats in Washington had instructions to try to, do precisely what Brendan was mentioning in here, that to dissuade the new president from appointing a special envoy, or most of all giving Gerry Adams a visa, and to inform and educate him about the complexities of the situation as the British saw it. And I would say, we'll note that the Clinton administration did not nominate a special envoy and did not give Gerry Adams a visa, and there were those who supported him in the campaign who said he wasn't keeping his campaign promises. But as he settled into office, I think he did come to understand that it was, yes, a little more complex than might have first been apparent, or maybe it was. But in any event, we had that period of getting to know the situation and working for deciding on how to proceed. And the British made no secret of their concerns about these promises.
Just reinforces the complexity of it. Sorry, Brendan.
Okay, the next example then moves the situation forward to 1994. So next slide, Lindsay. And these relate to the decision to grant Gerry Adams a visa in 1994, in January 1994. The first, on the left-hand side, the first document comes from a meeting between Kathleen's immediate predecessor in the office in Belfast, Val Martinez, and the then head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, David Fell, where it's just the background when the invitation to Gerry Adams and other political leaders to visit Northern Ireland, or to visit a conference in New York, has been being discussed. And in this particular conversation, Val Martinez makes it very clear that his view that he's expressing back to Washington is that Adams should not be granted the visa at this particular time. But at the same time, I think he uses the term, he's not 100% guaranteeing that his particular advice will be taken on board back in Washington. As both Paul and Kathleen have mentioned earlier on, that decision to grant Adams a visa produces a, to put it politely, a diplomatic row between London and Washington. And the document on the right-hand side gives allows you a little window into the views of the UK government at this particular time. It was written by Robert Lyne, who was then John Major's private secretary, and it recounts a briefing that he was to be given. He had just given to the then American ambassador in London. I think, if I remember rightly, Ray Seitz. Is that pronounced right, Kathleen?
Yep.
Yes.
And it basically sets out what Lyne has told Seitz in terms of how strongly opposed London is to the decision, how it fears that the granting of the visa has come too early. It's come at a very delicate moment in time in terms of it's just a few weeks after the signing of the Downing Street Declaration, and the belief that this premature decision could potentially damage the prospects for moving the political situation in Northern Ireland forward. Obviously, I couldn't look at examples from the documents at PRONI without mentioning going on to now look at the visit itself. And a couple of things strike you as you look at the files that deal with the visit. And the first of these is, and probably Kathleen will probably agree on me on this one, is that the tortuous amount of time that was spent on between officials coming up with an agreed itinerary of what President Clinton would do on the day itself. And one of the sticking points seemed to, in particular, to have been was an idea that President Clinton should visit or tour one of the peace walls in Belfast. And the officials in Belfast were aghast at the idea of this. They simply did not think this was a particularly good idea. So this draft, I think, comes from around about the middle, 14th or 15th of November. So in what I've read and looking at some of the video clipping of the time, I think it's a pretty close to the final agreed program, but Kathleen probably would need to look at this near the time herself and see if that's the case or not. Unfortunately, I should stress that this item and the next couple are not yet up on CAIN, simply because unfortunately the COVID situation has delayed progress at our end and also at PRONI as well. But we hope to have this up on in the near future. Kathleen, I'll put you on the spot. There's in the memo on the itinerary, it mentions the possibility of Clinton getting out of the car and doing an OTR. Can I ask what an OTR is?
Yeah, so an OTR I think means off the record, or I mean not on the.
I'm glad you said that. OTR means something else sometimes.
I'm pretty sure it means off the record, but what it is something that doesn't appear on the official itinerary. And the two very important, it doesn't mean they're less important, the two very important OTRs in that morning schedule, which I'm peering into my screen here, is the stop on the Shankill, where President Clinton gets out of the car and buys some fruit from a fruit seller on the Shankill. Some oranges, as one of our participants here noted, and then goes to Mackey's. That took all of about 5 or 10 minutes, but again, a crowd gathers, there's crowds, and then after the Mackey's speech, drives down the falls and has an OTR, an off the record, unplanned, but very planned, stop at a bakery where Jerry Adams happens to be having a coffee. And jumps out there and goes in and chats with him for a while. So those are the OTRs, and there were others as well, but yeah.
Well, I have to admit, OTR most recently has controversy around on the run, so he wasn't doing anything with anybody on the run. That you made that very clear. He was stopping on the Shankill, meeting people like Jackie Redpath and others, I'm quite sure, and then stopping on the falls with the handshake. Sorry, Brendan.
Okay, I'll find the next, the other aspect of the visit that in the files that sort of fascinated me was, so could we have the next slide again, Lindsay, is particularly for the officials in Belfast, they stress the huge importance and significance of the visit itself. On the right-hand side is a little memo produced by the then head of the Information Services in Northern Ireland. People sometimes can remember his face, a man called Andy Wood. I can remember seeing him in clips from the past. Mm-hmm. And basically in this particular memo, Wood is making the point that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for to showcase Northern Ireland to the world's media. And he sets out a number of steps how that could be done. On the left-hand side then, again, going back maybe to something Paul mentioned, in terms of, both Paul and Kathleen have both mentioned, in terms of economic development. That again is something that officials in Belfast were very keen to build on and develop as much as possible. So the left-hand side, the memo comes from the body that was then tasked with promoting economic development in Northern Ireland, the Industrial Development Board, and it makes the point that it's very important for to put out good news stories relating to the visit, particularly to those markets in which IDB is trying to attract investors to come to put their business in Northern Ireland. I guess is, you know, again, going back to the period of time, the end of the ceasefires, this notion that Northern Ireland is moving into a new period, and this notion that, if you like, Northern Ireland PLC is open to business, something that they were very, very keen and to promote out of the visit.
Okay.
I'll finish by trying to sum up from my perspective what are the benefits of adding this archival material on CAIN. And I thought I would finish off with leave the words to somebody else to try to sum up. So could I have the next slide, Kirsty? Could you just click now? And they come from a British statesman of the early 20th century. Some people may have heard of him, F.E. Smith or Lord Birkenhead. And Birkenhead by profession was a lawyer. And these comments are attributed to him at one case he presented. He was in front of an absent-minded judge who had, throughout proceedings, caused him great annoyance by constantly interrupting him and asking silly questions and making silly points. And so towards the end, in summing up his evidence in the case, Smith thought, okay, I'm going to be very careful here. I'm going to be very clear and concise and sum up my evidence so the judge won't interrupt me one more time. But much to his frustration, he does. And this little interchange happens between Smith and the judge. I'm sorry, Mr. Smith, but I'm none the wiser, to which Smith Birkenhead replies, no, my lord, but you are better informed. And hopefully people using CAIN will be better informed with some of the records we have made available. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brendan. I'm none the wiser who cousin Mick was in that presentation, but I suspect that was deliberate. And if anybody wants to find out who cousin Mick was or anything
Peter,
else, please.
I can actually tell you that in that one of the proposed trips that was abandoned on the itinerary was that President Clinton was supposed to go to his family homestead in Fermanagh. And I think it was his mother's side was related to the Cassidys in that part of the world. But after much soul searching and negotiations, it was finally decided that was out of the question. And I think one of the memo I came across, it actually says there would be no time for the Cassidys on this particular trip.
No time for the Cassidys. That's a real pity. That's Ambassador Stephen's fault, I'm quite sure. Okay, Brendan, thank you very much for that. We're both wiser and better formed at the end of it. Robert, you were a producer at UTV, as Anne said at the time. Give us your reflections at the Guildhall. What's your main memory?
Well, I still have all my press passes from the time, which I keep, and I have a huge file of papers and documents in respect of the entire visit, which was coordinated by Cathy Grieve of the BBC. But because it was not a state visit, it meant that the broadcasters had to pay for all their own costs. And I was just astounded looking through the paperwork that each outside broadcast visit cost at least £25,000, which in 1995 was quite a lot of money. But how the broadcasters recouped that, in a sense, they then syndicated it around the world to different broadcasters. And it was the same with the visit in Armagh or in 1998 when President Bill Clinton came back. In fact, we were so well organized then that I thought the Bible was only the first and second, the New Testament and the Old Testament, but they actually produced a Clinton Network Bible to cover that visit. So all these documents are very interesting, I find anyway, and I'd be happy to donate them to the Public Record Office because it gives an interesting perspective behind the scenes. And I see my old colleague there, Don McAleer, from the Northern Ireland office, who was one of the liaison press officers in Derry, and I had to send him the original camera positions from the Guildhall, which was so that he could seek clearance from the American authorities. And I must say that this was a highlight of my broadcasting career, 33 years in UTV, and it was stage managed and choreographed to the last word. There were a number of let's say problems came along the way, because as a representative for the International World Television Pool, I was expected, along with Tom Reid, who was our engineering manager up in the Northwest, to cover everything from the Derry-Eglinton Airport arrival right through the 10 kilometre, 6.2 miles down the road to the Guildhall. So there's an expectation from the world media to cover all of that. The first problem was that the Air Force One jumbo jet couldn't land at Eglinton, at the Derry City Airport, because the runway was too short. So they decided that the presidential party would arrive in Black Hawk helicopters. And the White House official...
They were going to land at Knock instead. I was really surprised there.
No. So they're going to arrive in these Seahawk helicopters. And
Robert, we've got about 30 seconds, by the way, because we're coming to the close.
Long story short, we put a satellite live camera up there, but then I was faced with how do I cover the distance that on the 40 vehicle motorcade right the way down. So our partnership, they agreed that I could put a camera at the very back end of the motorcade, so that if the presidential limousine got a flat tire or there was anything untoward, the cameraman could then jump out and take footage of that for the world press. But it was a privilege to work on that.
Thank you, Robert. I can just see the photographs of President Clinton repairing his own flat tire. I'm sure that would have made front page news everywhere around the world. Okay, look, thanks, Robert. That was a super insight, and everybody here, I'm sure, could add their own insights as well. And apologies to everybody else for not being able to get to you. But we're going to go first of all to Janet Hancock again to talk a little bit about the Clinton Library. And then I have 3 specific questions that I'm afraid, Paul, are more to Kathleen than they are to you. You'll be relieved to hear. But if there's anybody with final questions, please do post them on the chat. But first of all, Janet, you want to talk a little bit about the Clinton Library.
I'll be very brief, but I just wanted to mention the William J. Clinton Presidential Library, which houses over 78 million pages of documents, 20 million emails, and 2 million photographs relating to the Clinton presidency. We contacted them in advance of this event, and they kindly pointed us to some material which has been digitized. And interestingly, just following up on the on the children's event. I had a quick look when the email came in, and I couldn't work out why there was lots of references to UFOs in links that were supposed to be about Northern Ireland, until I think it was Brendan reminded me that President Clinton was answered in his speech a question from a 13-year-old Belfast boy named Ryan, who had written to him asking a very specific question, and President Clinton said, no, as far as I know, an alien spacecraft did not crash at Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. And Ryan, if the US Air Force did recover alien bodies, they did not tell me about it, and I really want to know. So what I'm getting at here is actually, whilst that's a flippant comment that I'm making there, the amount in the files which shows that actually the presidency and the White House actually did investigate this and make an informed response to that 13-year-old Belfast boy, I think is quite fascinating. And the other one I just wanted to draw attention to is that there's a really good exhibition on the Clinton Presidential Library website, and I'll drop links to these into the chat. But there's loads of background and lots of information about the day, and some highlights from the documents on the White House side. And one of the things I picked up was that the First Lady went to meet a women's drop-in centre in South Belfast, where she met a woman called Joyce McCartan, which Hillary Clinton later goes on to quote in her autobiography, Living History, saying it takes a woman to bring men to their senses. And interestingly enough, when Hillary Rodham Clinton returned to speak in Belfast a couple of years later, she brought the gift that she'd been given by this group, which was a simple stainless steel teapot, and she perched it in the lectern in honour of these women and the humble work that they and many others did in their little corners of Belfast and everywhere else to try and bring about peace. So there's some lovely bits and bobs in there. You might want to have a look. And over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Janet. I have three final questions. I'm going to direct them at you, Ambassador Stephens, but I also want you and Paul, if you could briefly, right at the end, to tell us your thoughts now, 25 years on, about this visit. But my three questions to you, Kathleen, and these are coming from the folk who have been watching and participating today. In terms of that photograph, organisers of the visit really didn't want a photograph taken, did they? Why was that? And who do you think took that short film clip?
I don't know who I'll make this lightning round. I don't know who took the amateur video. This was pre-cell phones, obviously, or at least cell phones that had cameras on them. But yes, this was an OTR, an off the record, and there was a desire that the photo for the day, remember this is still morning, not be the president shaking hands with Jerry Adams on every front page. So there was an explicit desire to not make it easy to take a photograph.
And we have talked about unionism. We've talked about the handshake with Jerry Adams and the British and Irish governments and many others. One figure we haven't mentioned so far is John Hume. What was the importance of John Hume and his relationship in the United States and to the organising of the visit?
Well, thank you for raising that, and those who put in the chat, because that, yeah, kind of overarching all of this is the relationships, the trust that John Hume built throughout the United States, particularly in Congress and with the Clinton White House. This underlay all those events we talked about leading up to the visit, and certainly was very much an overarching theme of the visit. And President and Mrs. Clinton going to the Guildhall was obviously to go to an important city in Northern Ireland, but to pay tribute to John Hume. So I'm glad that was raised. We should have mentioned that earlier.
Yes, who passed away recently as well, unfortunately. And the final question, Kathleen, and a very important question. Is it true that President Clinton wanted to play the saxophone with Van Morrison, but was denied that either because of time or because of Van Morrison himself?
I don't know if he wanted to. What I do know is that the schedule was running so late that the president and his party were headed back from the Guildhall and arrived at City Hall while Van Morrison was still performing. So as far as I know, and I was with the president, he didn't, I didn't see the performance live. I always heard rumors that Van Morrison, he was wearing the saxophone around his neck, that he had one there, and but I never heard the president mention whether he wanted to or not. But in any event, I'm sure he watched the performance on tape afterwards.
I can confirm Van Morrison was wearing a saxophone, and there's like this finish just before the presidential party emerged from the city hall. They hadn't arrived at that stage, so it was actually "In the Mood" was the song that played the president in, with the John Anderson Big Band.
And finally, as somebody said, let's acknowledge also the role of the late Ambassador Jean Kennedy Smith in some of this as well. Paul, final comment. How significant was this?
I think really we have covered that. In terms of events, it was momentous, absolutely momentous. And rather than see it as a single event, it started a process which goes on to this day, a process which has moved us away largely from violence. I'm glad that someone did mention John Hume's role, because, both President Clinton and the First Lady really did appreciate all that John had done. And since John's death, some of us have established a John and Pat Hume Foundation, because we have to recognize the role that she played was equally important. Now, so going back to President Clinton becoming president and onwards, the Humes had been playing a role in the United States, certainly from the mid-1970s. And you saw that in particular in 1977, when Senator Ted Kennedy wrote into the congressional record the role played by the Ulster Scots in the development of the United States. That was very important, because that's when the United States began to address unionist fears. And as well as that, the four horsemen, Senators Kennedy, Moynihan, Governor Hugh Carey, and who was the fourth?
Tip O'Neill?
Tip O'Neill, of course. I should never have forgotten Tip O'Neill. Yeah, they put out a statement St. Patrick's Day 1977 where they condemned political violence outright. And that was very important, and again helping to persuade later on the IRA to decide that there's no future in this. So you can't see just that day. That day was a culmination of work that had been going on for a long time, and that day was one that set a sequence which brought us to the 1998 agreement and to what has happened ever since.
And Kathleen, final word from yourself. How significant was this in your career? I know you're still in touch with President and Mrs. Clinton. How significant do you think it was for them?
Oh, I know it was extraordinarily significant for them, and you see it in the memoirs they've written. I actually had a chance to see them in an event a few months ago where they were speaking actually with the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and if I just say Northern Ireland to them, it just clicks, kind of like this conversation today. It's very important. I've seen a lot of presidential visits. I've never seen one quite like this. It's very gratifying, obviously, and I really appreciate, and I would say, the look that that's being done into some of the aspects of it, and for example, the aspect of the next generation and so on, and what the impact of that has been, is something I want to think some more about, and I would be happy to be in touch with anyone who wants to explore these themes further. I sort of fear that a visit like this, an American presidential visit like this, we talked about security and other things, would be very, very difficult to imagine right now anywhere in the world. But I think it's a reminder, and I hope a inspiration to my successors and all in American diplomacy and in American politics to not forget that, these visits, these speeches can play a positive role, and I hope again in this, as many things, that Northern Ireland, this experience, has some lessons not only for itself but for the world and for the United States.
Well, thank you. And can I finish the session off? First of all, Ambassador Stephens, Kathleen, thanking you for not just what you did all those years ago. Well, it wasn't all that long time ago. It makes us all sound very old. For 25 years ago, for your commitment and incredibly hard work and the vision that the American administration and you showed in putting this visit on, and with as much of a success as it was. I do think it was seminal, and I think it had a tremendous impact on the few years since when we finally ended up with the Good Friday Agreement. So thank you for what you did then, and thank you for what you've done today and sharing those memories with us. Can I say also thank you to Professor Paul Arthur, incredibly stimulating and wonderful knowledge of things past as well as present. Paul, thank you very much for all your contribution over the years, but also what you did this afternoon as well. Thanks to PRONI, to NI Screen, to CAIN and to ARK for putting this event on. I have found it incredibly stimulating. And it's a reminder to me, I think, amongst many other things, that the past has a huge influence on the present and on the future. And this event, 25 years past, has just been it's a powerful reminder of how important events like this. And let's hope as the years go on and the United States, amongst many other countries, continue to play a generous and external and outward looking role in the world, that we see more progress in places like Northern Ireland and Ireland and elsewhere in the world. But also especially thank you for everybody who's joined us over the last couple of hours or so. It's a long time in terms of an event online, a webinar like this, to be part of, but it has been incredibly worthwhile. I'd usually say at this stage, thanks and safe home. I don't think I have to say safe home, probably. Thanks for joining us, and let's keep up the conversation.